So you've asked me how I came to do what I'm doing, so I guess I really need to begin by defining what I'm doing. Um, I am an artist, I'm a writer, I do genealogy consulting, do a lot of public speaking, and I came out of a long career in finance. And often when people hear that I was in finance, they don't put that together with art. That seems like a disconnect. And I spent a lot of my career in finance saying, I'm really not a financial person, even though I had all these financial credentials. And so I began to think about what's the common thread across all of the things that I do. And I realized that what I do is I solve puzzles and I tell stories. And that relates to artwork, it relates to genealogy, it relates to finance. So that's really, that would allow me to predict the next thing that I do. It will have those qualities in it. And everything I do has developed really in a very organic way. I left my career, my job, about 10 years ago. And it's kind of scary when you make a big change like that. And I had to think about what I was going to do with my time and my energy. And I said, I'm going to focus on my artwork and family history. And at the time, I really didn't know what that meant or what that would look like. And I find that when I'm interested in getting into a new territory, I often will take a class or I'll volunteer for something as a way to get familiar with it. So at the time, I did some research and I found the Jewish Historical Society of the Upper Midwest. And I called them up and I said, I want to volunteer. And they were doing oral history projects. And I thought, oh, well, they'll have me do an oral history. When I went and talked to them and they learned that I was very involved in genealogy, they said, you know, we do a talk on genealogy each year. Will you do our talk? And my initial reaction, which I didn't say, fortunately, was, you've got to be kidding. I had kind of the same reaction that most people have to getting up in front of people and having them all looking at me and worrying that I was going to say something that was going to make me look like an idiot. And then I thought, you know, if you want something different to happen, sometimes you have to do different things. And I said yes. So I did the talk. I prepared like crazy, had a fabulous time, realized that my knowledge was quite deep and I really liked teaching, which I didn't know until that point. I walked out the door and this was at the Sabas JCC, and next door there was a Teichman Shapiro gallery. I looked into the gallery and my head's spinning with family history, and I thought, wow, that'd be a great place to do a show on family history. So I went to my studio and I started painting. And I started doing a series on my own family history, taking all the stories and images and documents and weaving that into artwork. This is where the organic part comes in. My husband came home and said, oh, I know somebody who said we should go see a show that's going to be at the Teichman Shapiro Gallery and that we'd like it. So we go to the show. The gallery director, Robin Awen, was in the gallery, and she said, oh, it doesn't start until tonight. You should come back. We're going to have an opening, and we're going to have an artist talk. So we came back, and much to my surprise, all my friends from the Jewish Historical Society were there because the show was on a family history theme. And they asked me what I was doing. I showed them, well, I told them what I was doing. My husband was kind of elbowing me, saying, show them the pictures, because before I had an iPad, I carried pictures around of what I was doing. And I was a little shy about it. I showed them the pictures, and they asked if Robin was familiar, had seen them. And I said no. I'd been a little shy about sharing it with her, too. They motioned her over. She looked at them, and she said, you should submit a proposal. So I submitted a proposal. Then I went off to China. We were traveling in China for a month. I was trying to do all the things that I couldn't normally do when I was working full-time. And in the middle of our trip, we checked our emails at a little place in China, and there was an email from Robin saying, we'd love to have you do a show in January. Now this was July. I wasn't going to be back until August. And so I asked her a very important question. I said, how many paintings would it take to fill the gallery? And she came back and she said 20. And I had 7. So of course I said, great, I'd be happy to do it in January. And then started trying to figure out in my head what I was going to do when I was back home a month away. And came back, did the paintings, trying to figure out anything I could do to take up wall space. That was my first solo show. My husband built my frames. It really was the start of much of what I have done since. There were several things that came out of that proved to be very significant in everything that followed. That actually involved writing as well as artwork, because I posted the stories, and it involved a lot of storytelling on my part and kind of took me into that world. So I can elaborate a little bit, I guess, on that. I guess that, if you've ever been involved in genealogy and tried to tell someone a family story, there's usually a point where their eyes glaze, where you say something like, oh, my second cousin once removed, and they're busy trying to figure out what that is, and you've lost them. So when it came time to do an artist talk, and I had these stories embedded in this artwork, I remember I said to my husband, I just don't know what to talk about. I have these stories, but I don't know if anyone's going to be interested, because I was afraid of the glaze. And he said, tell the stories. I got up, I told the stories, and people were really engaged. And I began to analyze what was different. And I realized it was because I had the artwork up, the image, as I told the story. And I think it gave the viewer an anchor, a reference point. It meant I told a better story because I had a focal point as well. That was my cue cards. And since then, everything I've done has really kind of tied to image and story in text as well as image. And I often have people come to my studio. They'll come through during Art Whirl, and I'll tell them a story about a painting. And they'll come back the next year, and they'll say, I want you to tell my friend that story you told me. And they remember it because of the image and the story in combination. So that combination is really important. The other thing that came out of that show was, people really responded to it. So they went through and they wrote in the book, and they gave me really interesting comments. One woman wrote, I don't know anything about my own family, except I know they came from the same area that yours did. So as I went through the show, I read everything and I studied the artwork, and I pretended like your family was my family. And that really touched me. I was surprised by that. And I really felt that I wanted to do artwork that would draw that response, that sense of connection, that what I was talking about was something they could relate to. So I think, I often have painted on difficult subjects. I've done work on the Holocaust, on loss of memory, things that people are scared of. Those are hard things. But by doing it through story and personalizing it, it reaches out to people and pulls them in before they even realize that they're in. And so it feels really meaningful to me to make that connection and to use artwork and words and storytelling. Because when people come into my studio, I tell stories. And I never thought of myself as a storyteller, but I seem to have turned into one.
So I've got to ask, what were you like back in the days when you were doing finance?
What was I like?
I mean, did you have these revolutions? A bird came in with $2 million and said, put this someplace.
When I was doing, part of, I had to unlearn some things that were in my makeup to create. I'm a very driven person. I like to, get to a conclusion. I like to solve puzzles. And that's what I've enjoyed doing in finance, was figuring out what drove things, how a system worked, how the pieces interrelated. So that was always what was interesting to me. But when I began focusing on my artwork, I had to change my approach quite a bit. I think, being somebody who liked to know where I was going and being in control runs counter to creating, because when you're creating, you don't know where you're going. That's why you're creating. And I had to really learn to let go of that, or trick myself into letting go of it. There was a point where I was painting reflections to force myself to see things differently. And I had to learn how to play. I don't think I knew how to play very well until then. So it's been a learning process for me. And it's been interesting how organically things unfold, and really exciting things happen that I couldn't have planned if I was in control. But then I'm very grateful that they've happened.
So while you were doing finance, were you painting on the side? How were those two lives working?
I was painting. My husband and I, my husband's an artist as well. We had a studio in the California building. It's been about 15 years now. And I started out sharing a studio with him, and I had a little corner. And then I began expanding until I began to take it over. And then the space next door came open, so we took that and knocked a door between the two. So it's the ideal arrangement for couples who are both artists. I have a door I can close, and or I can open it and I have a suite. And we both have room to hang our artwork and to listen to the music we prefer to listen to, or silence is in my case. Yeah, I was painting, but I was painting in a different way. I was painting for me. I wasn't painting with the objective of showing, or of necessarily having a dialogue with other people. And I used to debate with my husband what an artist was. Is an artist somebody who shows their artwork? And I always argued that you're an artist if you create art. Now, that it's a different kind of artist when you move into showing your work. And what I do now, that's very much a part of the circuit. I create it, I engage in dialogue with other people, they respond to it, and I often get feedback from them that might influence what I do. So it's changed how I've worked. In the past 10 years, I am definitely engaging with other people. But before that, I was creating art, but I was creating it for myself.
Okay. So, was it a hard decision to quit, to shift to doing art full time?
It is a hard decision. And I didn't know what I was doing at first. I didn't know what I'd be doing. And it wasn't just art. It was genealogy, it was writing, it was many other things. And I found that I don't want to just be one thing. I mean, that's the trouble with being in a job, quite honestly, is they want you to be one thing and do the things that they need done. And that doesn't always allow for all these other skills that you may have. So when you leave that, you have the ability to explore really a range of skills and to combine them where it makes sense, or to use them just in different ways. So, it's always, there's a psychological component to leaving a job. Even when, you've saved and you're in an okay position, you still never feel like you're okay until you kind of go through a period of time to kind of play that out. But it was at a point where the company I was working for was selling off a part of the business. It was going to change my job. Key people were leaving. It was an opportunity to leave, and leave with ideally a package, so I can make that leap. Of course, then the market went down immediately. So it's a transition, and transitions are hard. They're hard, especially if you're somebody who likes to be in control and know where you're going. And you don't really know where you're going.
Yeah. you don't have to say more than you want, but I'm also curious about this marriage. I mean, here's a control person. What do you marry? An artist.
There are pros and cons.
What's that like?
When we travel, we go to a lot of museums. So I sometimes think I take that for granted, that I'm with somebody who enjoys the same things and is interested in the same things. So I don't know. My husband paints in a very different way than I do. He doesn't tell me often what he thinks about something I'm working on. I have to pull it out of him. And yeah, so it's kind of learning how each other works, and when you can say something and when you can't. I've kind of learned when he's in process not to say anything, because his process is he has to be listening to his own voice at first, and mine will confuse it. So I think it's, as with anyone, it's figuring out the points where you interact and the points where you give the person room.
So how far back does this genealogy and family history interest go?
I think I've always been interested in it. I began doing oral histories many, many years ago. But I think at the point that I left my job, I'd been doing intensively family history for only about 5 years, not counting the oral histories. And I, as with most things, I dove into it. For a long time, I hesitated to do it because I knew I was going to run into the Holocaust in my family history, and I didn't know that I wanted to go there. But when I did finally decide to dive in, I went to Germany and I did research in the Holocaust records, and I've tracked down second cousins and third cousins in Paris and Israel, and so it's very consuming. And I do a lot of work with other people as well, and a lot of consulting and public speaking on that. So it's that solving puzzles, and it's solving puzzles so you can tell your family story, which I think is really important for people to understand where they came from.
So what are the bones of your family story?
Oh, the bones. I don't have any great mysteries. It's fairly typical. I mean, I have family that came from Poland and the Ukraine and Belarus. I visited all those towns. I do websites on 2 of them for people, virtual communities for people researching their family from those areas. I had the opportunity to go to Poland, to the town my grandfather came from, and exhibit artwork that I had done on that town in Poland. And I went there with a very dear friend who's a survivor from that town, who was 15 years old when the war broke out. And she took me around the town and told me about the community that my family was a part of. And it turned out her grandmother and my grandfather's brother were at the same address in the 1930 business directory. So we figure our family knew each other some 80 years ago. And then we connected here in Minneapolis when I was actually, I had somebody in Israel and somebody locally, both introduced me to her, and we've become very, very close friends. We do a lot of speaking together on the Holocaust. She's done that all her life, and I often will interview her. So I had, just when I say things developed organically, I was thrown together with her. We had this wonderful connection. We went to this town together, and to have the opportunity to exhibit my artwork and then the photographs that she had from her time in that community together was something very special.
Yeah. I've done just a little bit of interviewing from sort of Holocaust survivors. I didn't have much access, but is there anything special about that kind of oral history work?
It's a journey. I should mention, I've done a number of interviews with elders that were survivors. I did a series of interviews and developed artwork around them, interviews with people, residents of Shalom. So there were people who grew up in early immigrant communities, survivors, and immigrants from the former Soviet Union. I'm actually working on turning that into a book right now. But I developed artwork on their stories, and I think with the people I interviewed about the Holocaust, the paintings were more challenged, almost collage-like in some respects, because there were so many elements. It's not a simple story. And some of them, it was very hard for them to tell their story. But I think it was sometimes freeing for some of them to have done that. And there was one woman who was on the Kindertransport, and I felt like it was a little, I had to kind of pull the story out when I had the painting up, and it wasn't a representational sort of painting, so I didn't know how she would respond. She was actually in the first audience I spoke about the work, and she felt like it really captured how she felt. It was hanging where she was living. Somebody I know went there, ran into her by the painting, and she told the story. And I thought that was so fascinating that now she was telling the story. Before pulling it out originally, I don't think it came easily. But I think when the painting was on the wall, she really took ownership of it, and it was her story. So I don't know. It's different with each person, but the common thread really is their journeys. And they often would start the story telling it through a child's eyes, especially people that were in Germany, because they were still children when it was developing. Because in 1933, they began to see the beginning, whereas people in Poland didn't see it till 1939. So it's seeing it through different eyes as they matured during those years.
And what's the process like of working from a story to a painting? I mean, of letting a painting arise out of a story.
It's a good question. When I started to do the paintings, well, first I was doing the interviews, and I felt out of my depth. I was learning a lot as I did it. Each time I did one, I'd say, oh, I'm going to do that differently next time. And then there'd be another thing. I would say, oh, I'm going to do that differently next time. Then I got to the paintings, and I thought, oh, I know how to do this. And then I realized I really didn't know how to do this. And at first I thought, well, should I do portraits? Often you'll see a series on survivors, and it's portraits. And that didn't feel right, because it was about story. It wasn't a point in time. Stories happen throughout your life. So I'd often write prose poetry as a way to get into the story. I'd put myself in their shoes. It's very much about stepping into their experience, and that was a way that it let me do that. I would read the transcript, and then I would go grocery shopping or something. I'd do something totally different, and I would see what would bubble up. And there were pieces that would stay with me, either because they were visual or they were a surprise. They were something I didn't expect. There were little pieces of knowledge that I got out of these interviews that I would not have gotten any other way. And so a lot of the paintings, either it was something that was very visual or something that was a surprise. Sometimes I would do portraits, but it might be of their mother or father or a sibling, or them at a much younger age, which I was making up as I went along. So they all developed differently, and I had to find the center of the story. And that was a process. And I used different ways to try to find my way into the center.
You mentioned that you and your husband visit museums as you travel. Is there anybody who stands out as an artist who taught you things that taught about how to work with the kind of material that you now work with?
I don't know that I have a good answer to that. There are many artists that I respond to different things in their work, but I don't know that there is one predominantly. Somebody else looking at my work might see something that I don't. I don't know. Yeah, I don't. I'm trying to think of anybody who. There's many artists I admire. I don't know that there's one that I would say is my model for how I paint. I kind of find my way. But I'm sure everything that I've seen filters in some fashion.
Yeah. I'm just kind of running through the pieces and thinking, in which ones does one want to say there has to be a story there?
Yeah,
and of course Chagall comes to mind.
Yeah, and there's some work I've done that people see Chagall, but honestly, I don't. I mean, I see in that particular painting where they may come there, but I don't think I was thinking Chagall. You know, when I was doing more portraits, Alice Neal I always enjoyed. But I don't know that there's. I'll walk out of here and I will definitely think of one the minute I walk out the door. That's the way that works. But I'm not coming up with one that influences specifically how I work. I feel like how I work has evolved in tandem with me and how I think and how I see the world.
Talking to different artists, I think sometimes people are kind of driven to do work by the fact that their emotions they need to sort out. The work becomes and that people talk about it. The work becomes a therapeutic process, and other people don't think that way. They're doing something quite different, and sometimes you get a very kind of no, that's the wrong thing to think about with my stuff. I'm wondering how that works for you.
The answer is it depends. When you said that, it rang a bell with one body of work that I've done. After I finished the work on family history, I decided to go to Lithuania to study Yiddish. I went to the Vilnius Yiddish Institute. I was there for a month and a couple of weeks traveling in Eastern Europe. And I came back and I was kind of confused about a lot of what I saw there, a lot of how they dealt with the Holocaust. They had a genocide museum in a town that 45% of it was Jewish, 95% of them were murdered. And at the time, I'm told they've added something now, at the time they had nothing about the Jewish community that was murdered in their genocide museum. Their story was very much about the Soviets. And there was a lot of complicity with the Nazis. When I talked with survivors in that area about partisans, they were, some of them were partisans working with the Soviets against the Nazis. When the Lithuanians talked about partisans, they were talking about Lithuanians working with the Nazis, not against them. And so it was confusing. It was not what you would expect. And I came back and I started doing a series of artwork, trying to sort it out. And I started writing about it as well. So I think in that case, it was very much as you described, where I was trying to work it through and make sense of it. But I don't know that other work I've done has been oriented in that way. I don't know, maybe as I think about it, I'm thinking maybe so. I did with the interview series, it's the Jewish Identity and Legacy series, I was looking at my own identity and how I define it, and part of what I do when I'm trying to figure something out is I talk to other people and I'm interested in their experience. So that had some of those elements of trying to figure something out. Usually I figure things out in writing. It's when I write, things come together in a way I don't always anticipate at the front end.
When I was in Vienna, I visited the documentation center of the Austrian Resistance, which is run by an elderly journalist who has been, I think it's putting it very mildly to say, extremely critical of Austria's current response to everything and everything Jewish, and to their attitudes with regard to their own complicity in the Holocaust. Yeah. And so the government has given him the leadership of this institute. I read every card in the museum, and the upshot of it is there was no Austrian resistance to speak of. No. I mean, there were a few people who hadn't got it, just how ruthless the Nazis were, and for a while they protested, and then they got shot. Yeah. And then you can find individual people. So here's this guy who's mad because there wasn't any, he had no allies. Running a museum, which, if you bother to read the little cards, says he had no allies to speak of. Yeah. But, of course, it existing as a museum says kind of the opposite thing, which is there is this thing called the Austrian Resistance. So I couldn't help coming away thinking that his job had sort of muzzled him.
Yeah, that would be challenging. They do have a program where, I forget the name of it. But they send people to work in Holocaust museums as part of, it's like a national service thing. And there was a young man in the Yiddish program who was working in the museum in Vilnius from Austria.
Yeah. Well, there's of course there's every kind of response in a country. I mean, you have every range of things. But I hadn't, I hadn't been expecting quite some of what I ran into there. Yeah. And it goes to this matter, which I think is, which you touch on with regard to the museum of, and it came up just recently with the Holocaust Remembrance Day sort of issue about, the failure of the current administration to mention Jews in the context of Holocaust remembrance.
Well, that was very controversial in Lithuania. When you could still find old memorials where it would say X number of Soviet citizens were murdered. They wouldn't say Jews. It's of Soviet orientation.
And it sounds as if that kind of language is also becoming, for now anyhow, the public language in the United States.
Well, and it is a reframing, which to me is equivalent to denial, because you are obliterating the history that an entire culture was targeted. And that concerns me.
How do you think about anti-Semitism in the United States?
I think it's still present, but it's taking different forms, and it's present on the left as well as the right. And I don't know I don't know the response to it, quite honestly. I think it morphs into a different form. And it morphed into a form where it wasn't acceptable to say certain things, and now it seems to be acceptable. So, that too concerns me.
in Germany, there was a whole ideology around it, and also there was a long history of German-Jewish relations that fueled it. How do you understand the form it takes in this country, in the communities where you've run into it?
I think there's different kinds. I mean, you have the alt-right, which is probably an easier version to understand. You, on the left, I think how people respond to Israel. And Israel doesn't always help that by choices that they make. But I think it becomes focused on Israel, on Zionism, in certain segments, and it may take the form of anti-Semitism, and it may not. It may be just critical evaluation. So it's sometimes you have to parse it to figure out what the origin of it is. I think there tends to be a knee-jerk reaction. I mean, I think about when I was younger, and there was a knee-jerk reaction. It's everybody around you thinks a certain thing, you think the same thing, and you say the same thing, and there's an element of that.
Well, we've talked. We've given a lot of time to the family history piece of your work, but I think when you described your retirement, you said that there were a lot of projects. I'm wondering about other things that you've been working on and thinking about.
Well, I think one of the things I'm doing artwork-wise now, my mother passed away a year or two ago, and in the last few years of her life, she was losing memory, and I began to do artwork around the theme of memory and the loss of memory, and wrote quite a bit about that as well. As I was experiencing it along with her, I would call her each morning, and she'd say to me, "Where is everybody? I feel like I'm in a wilderness." And I'd think about what her wilderness looked like, and I would paint it, and I would write about it. And then when she passed away, and I was going through all the tasks of selling a childhood home, getting rid of things that had meaning that I always thought would be safely stored away there, and suddenly, either I take them or they go, I began to think about memory, the memory in a space, in a contained space. I did a series called The Memory Palace, which were little segments of the home I grew up in, with odd juxtapositions of things that housed memories. They actually, there's an idea of a memory palace that they use in memory competitions, where you walk through a childhood home or a place you know really well, and you put images mentally in the rooms in odd juxtapositions, and then you go around, because our memories are spatial, so you remember physically where you are, where you sat, in a restaurant. So you go through this place, your childhood home, and you pick up these memories. And it dawned on me that my mother's house was a memory palace. It was my memory palace. And so I started doing a series of small paintings that form a larger memory palace that were images that were so familiar to me because I grew up with them. So it kind of took me down a road. I mean, a lot of what I paint comes out of my experiences. And that's a very significant experience to go through the last years with a parent, and then the loss, and how you internalize that, how you take the absence of a person and integrate their presence into you. And I don't think you think about that until they're no longer there.
Yeah. My mother died on 24th of May, 2016, and so and the process was, it was sort of about 6 weeks during which you could sort of know more or less exactly where she was on the curve the whole time. So it was a very conscious thing. And so I those issues are also alive for me.
Yeah.
I also used to be an orderly actually at the Jewish Home for the Aged, so I had experience with different people's ways of entering, that period where you don't remember things, or or where your familiar context isn't around anymore. Wondering kind of how you came to think of aging as you watched this happen with your mother and especially where there is a real a loss of things that seem to be there forever.
Yeah, the things you take for granted.
Yeah.
I had to reframe it. I was very close to my mother. She was a marvelous person, just a wonderful person. And I always talked about books with her. Suddenly, she got to the point where she couldn't retain the thread of a story. She read voraciously and suddenly couldn't. But I always had great admiration for her, even as she went through these stages, because what she started doing was collaging. She called it cutting and pasting because she was a first grade teacher, and that was the vernacular.
Yeah.
And she would get her newspaper and she would cut it up and she would create some really cool collages. I have 21 collage albums in my studio right now. And I remember I actually interviewed her once when she was doing them, and I said, so tell me, how did you start this, and why do you do this? And and she didn't have answers to most of that. And then she said, well, Susan, you could do this too. And in some ways, I think she could do it better because she lost the judge in her head that was always critiquing. She just followed her eye, and she had, she was artistic in many ways. So I've always wanted to do a show with some of the work I'm doing inspired by her, but also frame some of her collages and incorporate them into it. Because what I find interesting is you retain the ability to create, which gives me some comfort if I follow in her footsteps someday. And I think, the fact that she still lived a purposeful life, really, I was proud of her on some level, that she did that. And I felt like when I was going through it with her, I didn't want to spend time thinking about what I had lost in our relationship, because I needed to be present for her while I had her. Mm-hmm. And then after she was gone, then I thought about the person before. But in those last few years, I really focused on being there for her. And I realized that she didn't always remember things, but she remembered feelings. And I had taken her on a number of trips to Europe, and she always associated me with adventures and doing things and going places. And so she had that association, but she couldn't remember the things we did. I had a memory jar that I gave her once as a gift when her memory was fine. It was a little jar, had memories carved into it, and I wrote out all these memories that I had shared with her. And it was a nice gift at the time, and then I saw it up on her bookshelf once after she had lost memory, and I took it down, and I had her read each one to me. Actually videoed it. And we talked about it. And some she remembered and some she didn't. And when we finished, she said to me, she thanked me for helping her remember. And I now have the memory jar. I haven't gone through it. It feels hard to go through it. But I started doing a series on the memory jar of paintings. So it becomes grist for the mill. And I actually painted one and put it in my studio and invited other people to write their memories of somebody that they had loved who lost memory, and a memory that they shared with them that the other half is no longer shared. And I did some paintings based on other people's stories. So I like the idea of pulling other people in. And so it's all of that kind of becomes grist for the mill and gives me a new way of thinking about things. And I've totally forgotten your question, but...
It's fine. Yeah, I remember a very powerful friend intellectually powerful friend lost memory, and her extremely artistic son-in-law kept finding in the moment ways of engaging the intelligence there. It was these stories, and I had not, you have to find the ways, or it doesn't happen. I know there's a Jewish tradition of ethical wills, and I thought about it a little bit with my mother, because I think within the as she realized that there really was an end pretty close in sight, she began sort of distilling down what she wanted to tell us. Did that happen at all in your case? Was there a message that kind of got repeated a number of different ways? Or
I think we were actually very good about sharing the messages along the way. At the end, it was kind of I love yous, and I had the gift of spending the last 2.5 weeks of my mother's life with her, camped out in her room, and it was really special, and it made me think about death differently, and I don't know that if it'll change how I deal with it someday. I don't know, but it was an eye-opening experience, and I felt like I don't know. I felt like I had the opportunity to be very present at a critical time. And I felt like I knew everything that was already important.
One aspect of your story strikes me, and that is that, fairly soon after you retired and went to volunteer, you ended up being a sort of public educator.
Yeah.
It had, and in two ways. I mean, first of all, in speaking about family history, and then very shortly thereafter doing a show.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned that discovering that you liked to teach and were good at it was one of the kind of retirement discoveries.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how you think of yourself as a teacher, and what is there a mission statement for that piece of your life?
Boy, good question. I'm not sure I know the answer to it. I spend a lot of time distilling things so other people can grasp them. I don't think the world should be complicated. I think it can be very simple, and a lot of people make careers out of making it complicated. So I do the opposite. I try to drill down and make ideas accessible. And it's a lot of work to make ideas accessible. Somebody has to kind of work with it and find concepts that other people can relate to. And I have great admiration for teachers who do it every day, because it's one thing to get up and do a talk. When you have the time to really do the groundwork and create it, it's a whole nother thing to be doing that every day. I don't think I'd like that as much. But I like thinking about ideas. And if you like thinking about ideas, then in doing that, you distill them. You try to bring a clarity to them, a different lens to them. And it's really quite delightful if you can then share that with other people and have them have an aha moment out of that.
Are there particular ideas that matter to you as things to distill and pass on?
There's a number. I mean, certainly, the work that I've done around the Holocaust and sharing stories has been important. And it's sometimes hard to do because it's hard material. The work I do around memory, that's something that I'm still putting the pieces together. I'm still working on a series. I like to have a series, so like each piece is kind of like a chapter in a book, mm-hmm. and it tells a larger story. Plus, I know I'm working in a particular direction. And so I need to figure out how I take that out and share it more widely. So that's something I'm still working on, but I think that's an important one. The things that we're scared of, those are the important ones. When I said, I think earlier, that some of the things I work with are really difficult subjects. Loss of memory, the Holocaust, people have fears about that. It's hard for them to deal with. And yet I think by personalizing it and using story, you give them access to it. And I see that when people come into my studio and I tell them stories. And I can see when I'm pulling them in and when they have that moment where it connects and it feels meaningful to them. So those are some, and there's probably many I have not yet discovered.
Mm-hmm. And how about audience? I mean, there, of course, one can say the audience is whoever comes into the studio, or the audience is whoever happens to encounter the work in any form. But I think sometimes, I think, for example, the peculiarity of talking about memory to people who haven't yet lost their memory, but are quite likely to.
But you'd be surprised how many people, they may not have lost memory, but they have a loved one who did. They have a parent or a grandparent. Virtually everybody who comes into my studio relates to that on some level. And I've had people thank me for having the memory jar there for them to write the memory about their family member, because it gives them something that they can do to acknowledge that person. So it's something that most people have a connection to on some level. They don't know quite how to work with the idea, so I give them a way to work with it.
Now, one of the ways that people run a thread through their lives, and especially in the Jewish tradition, is through religious ritual. And it sounds as if one of the things you do with your memory jar is to give people a kind of secular ritual.
Yeah.
But how do you stand to that enormous kind of mechanism for preserving, the religious mechanisms for preserving memory? I mean, the story of the Exodus, the Passover is both a way of preserving a very old memory and a way of imprinting memory through what happens at the family meal. How does all that work on you or for you?
The past 5 years I've been involved with the Jewish Artist Lab, which is a group of artists that are pulled together at the Sabus JCC, and we study. We have a theme each year. The theme this year is Inside, Outside, Boundaries, and Otherness. And then we create artwork or a piece we might read. It might be a performance. It could be, usually it's some sort of written, might be poetry, story, whatever. And so I've been thinking, in the past 5 years, as somebody who's pretty secular, but who feels very Jewish at the same time, which is why I did the Identity and Legacy series, it's been interesting to me because I've learned a lot that I didn't necessarily know, or that I knew a little bit, but I've learned more. So I think ritual is a very important thing, and we use it to mark changes, turning points. I've been very interested lately. I've been looking at the concept of liminality, which means threshold, and it's the space in between. So when we talk about inside, outside, as you go from one part of your life to another, you're in a liminal space, and it's a stressful and space and a space of change. And we often have rituals, certainly in Judaism, that mark that. And probably in every religion, because I think religions focus on that liminal space. So whether it's a bar mitzvah, or maybe it's a mezuzah on a threshold to a door. But I think the holidays too. The fact that we don't just look at slavery to freedom when we look at the Exodus, when we look at Passover, we really look at the journey from slavery to freedom. It's a liminal space. It's the space where change happens. And I find that concept really fascinating. And I'm trying to come up with an art piece that I can do around that theme. I'm not there yet, but I like the idea a lot, and I think that's very much reflected in the rituals of religion and in the holidays that we celebrate. There's very much that liminal element. We're celebrating the passage.
Were holidays important to you growing
up? Modestly. I mean, we celebrated them, but I don't know that I would say it was a big part or a significant part of my life.
Did they provide kind of memory hooks? I mean, as when you think back, do you have a memory of holidays? Or are there other? Is it work? Does it work other ways?
I think it works more other ways for me.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, to some extent I do, but I don't know that was. When I think of memories, that's not what I focus on, I guess.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, this business of, this concept of liminality. It's a different way of working, isn't it? I mean, you've been working for a very long time with stories.
Yeah.
and the art becomes almost as you put it, sort of the talking, the equivalent of the PowerPoint, the thing you can point to as you tell the story, that helps to sort of anchor the stories. And now you're thinking about in some ways quite a general concept. How does is that a different way of working for you?
I don't think I'm far enough in it yet to know. But I think it relates to artists on a broader level, because I believe that artists are liminal beings to a large extent. Artists bridge different worlds, and their artwork is created in that space in between in many cases. So I think it's very relevant to being an artist. And it's very relevant to reinventing yourself, to letting an organic process unfold. That's all about liminality. It's not at all about being a control person and knowing where you're going to go and getting there. It's a different dynamic. So I'm at this point, I just find it very intriguing. I know there's certainly, hopefully, one painting and probably more in there. And I've begun playing with it, because that's what I have to do, is play in order to get to the next step. So I actually have 2 canvases that I've been working on, but it's the space in between that's the liminal space, and I got to figure out what goes in the liminal space.
Yeah. So, are you previously you've worked in series. Are you thinking that this will also be a kind of series of paintings?
It may. I don't know that it will be. I always do one for the exhibition. So there's an exhibition each year, and we have a different theme each year. So that's one that I'll sometimes I take the piece I do and weave it into a broader series, if it works. But I'm designing it just for that particular exhibition. But if the idea takes off for me, because sometimes I'll do more than one painting trying to figure out what I'm going to put in the exhibition, so I end up with a series without even having intended to, just as I feel my way into what I'm going to do for it. So I don't know yet, I guess, is the answer to that.
Look forward to seeing what you come up with. Thanks lots.
Thank you.